I'm Hanson Su. I'm a curator here at the Computer History Museum. And would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm Michael Plitkins. I donated these artifacts to the museum 20-something years ago, and I've been wanting to do this sort of history capture session for about that long, and I'm really glad that we're here to do that today.
All right.
I'm Rich Page. I built some of these back in the 80s while I was still at Apple, before I went to Next.
All right. So, Michael, do you want to just give us a brief overview of all of these artifacts before we do a deep dive into each one?
Sure thing. So we have two separate computers here, but they're related. This is a prototype Lisa 1 that went with an Apple II as a disk storage system, I think is what Rich is pointing out. This is very similar to the shipping computer. This, on the other hand, is a complete prototype that never really saw the light of day. It was called, I'm told, the Great Little Machine, or GLM, and it is sort of like Lisa Mac hybrid type computer. And I acquired both of these in later 1999. And I actually...
How did you come by them?
They both went on eBay.
Oh.
From a gentleman that had at the time been in Santa Cruz by the name of Brian Thomas. And neither one sold on eBay. I did acquire from him a Lisa color card. And with that, I kind of contacted him and said, you know, I'm interested in these things still if you want to make some kind of a deal outside of eBay. And he kind of just blurted out like $8,000. And I said, okay, let's do it. I don't know why, I just did it. Well, I'll tell you what, the reason why is I think you need to know where things came from in order to know where you're going to go to a degree. There's an importance there. And so I purchased a bunch of older computers. I have been writing software and tinkering on hardware projects for ages. And I had already gotten a Lisa 2, and I bought it, and I wanted to actually see how did this thing, how does it work, right? It's different. It's one thing to see like a written description of a computer or an operating system or whatever, and it's another thing to actually experience how it worked, and you can see kind of the intent and the thinking of the folks that designed the software hardware in question. So I actually had tried to get these to work and got, to some degree, like I had to build the power supply. I didn't build, but I adapted that power supply because the GLM did not come with a power supply, and the gentleman, Brian, was unable to find it.
You see the power supply on the one that was there for David's. I would say high probability that the connector and pinout matches.
Matches that?
This one here.
Yeah, so I wound up messing around with this thing and getting the right signals because this was documented, right, what was there from, because it's a Lisa card cage, right? Yeah. So I got the right signals to come out and
you managed to power it up.
I managed to power it up. It never really got it to work. I couldn't get it to boot anything off the floppy drive. But anyways, so that's sort of a little bit of the background on how I got them and why.
So do you know about the provenance of these machines before that point? Like, where did he get it from?
Yeah, so I wound up having a long phone conversation with this guy, Brian, who is a very interesting individual. And I think he got both of them from the same individual that had been a developer of some kind at Apple, and they had been stored in an attic for a long time. And then somehow this guy Brian, he had all kinds of interesting stuff.
Where was he located?
Santa Cruz.
So I would say there's a high probability that, because Ken's name's on this one, Brian was in Santa Cruz, Ken was living in Santa Cruz.
Good. Okay.
That Brian probably got them from Ken.
Right. So that's an important kind of detail, is written in the back of this computer on the sheet metal. It says Ken Friedenbach, and I actually wound up tracking down and talking to Rich, 20-something years ago, after I donated these things to the museum, and I'd remembered this stuff about them, and I tracked down Rich at your company called Sierra, that was on the frontage Fairchild Drive, right across from NASA Ames, at the time where these things were probably sitting at that moment.
After Fairchild and HP, what happened was I was at Fairchild working there, going to school at San Jose, and John Couch was teaching a compiler class.
Right.
Because John and Bill Barrett had written a compiler book, and I don't remember the title, but it's easy to find. And it's kind of funny because my habit when I took a class was to read all the material as fast as possible, and maybe more than once. And you might argue this was sort of self-defense against teachers that can't teach. Several times I had a few of those.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, I went to this class that John was teaching about compilers, and his book wasn't published yet, and he handed out loose leaf copies of the book to all the students in the class. And early on, I made a Xerox copy of the book, and then as I went through the book, I started marking it up a little bit, and then I wrote some software to run as examples, and then a few weeks into the semester, I made the mistake. You understand why I say a mistake in a second. I made the mistake of giving the marked up copy to John, and John looked at it, and his eyes got really big, right? And because all of a sudden he realized what he had, right? It was all the examples corrected, right? and so the reason I say it was a mistake was, as I went back to the class, week after week, he was working at HP at the time, and he kept, asking me to come interview at HP. So after, I don't know, 2 or 3 months of him, telling me I should come interview, I did, and then I ended up at HP in January of '75, sort of halfway through that year. And then John Couch and Tom Whitney went to Apple in the fall of '78. And then, I don't know, one thing led to another, and at the end of that year, I ended up talking to John, and he said, why don't you come over and talk with us? And so, long story short, I went over and I talked with Mike Markle and a few others, but didn't meet Steve. And then a few days later, I met Steve, and I spent like 6 or 7 hours with Steve, and he talked me into coming to Apple. So that was December of '78, and I started January '79. And then Ken joined Apple sometime in 1980. I don't remember whether it was winter or spring, but early 1980. So,
What was his role?
so I was doing the monitor and the hardware prototypes and the assembler and kind of the fun part. We should talk about the debugger at some point. Did that, and then Steve Glanville had done the original compiler, and Chris Franklin picked that up, and Chris was moving the compiler forwards, and then Ken was doing the linker, and Bruce Daniels, before he sort of wandered off to work with the Lisa software team, he was doing the editor that we had. So Bruce was doing the editor, Chris was doing the compiler, Ken was doing the linker, and I was doing all the bits and pieces.
Quite a team.
Yeah.
So there was this one in '85. This one we decided this is about '83, I think.
This one is
I'm
83.
sorry, that one back there is '85. This one we said is '83. And so this is probably, late '80 or.
There are various dates. I mean, this on the Twiggy drive, it says 6/30/82.
Oh, '82.
It's got a
But that could have been
super early
But
asset
that could have
tag.
been put in later.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, what I was going to say, there was before Paul Baker did the main board,
81.
there was a precursor to this. It looked a lot like that in terms of form factor, but simpler. And it was the first one I built, and then Paul, started there and did the main board. And so I built early on, I built a debugger, and so I had an environment to do things in. And, I did, the obvious things, display memory, set memory, and that kind of stuff. And then eventually I got, to where you could list memory, not only in hex, but also with assembly language off on the side, so a disassembly, if you like. And then the fun part, I'm sure I'm not the only one that ever did it, but I did an IA command, immediate assembly. And what you did is if you typed, you got used to the syntax that got displayed on the listing.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you typed in just a assembly language string, what it would do is it started with binary 0 and disassembled it and compared it to the string you typed in. And then it incremented by 1 and then compared again and again. And it went very quick. And so you type in a string of assembly, hit return, and then almost immediately it pops back with the assembled hash and deposited in memory.
Wow.
That was kind of fun.
That's cool. Yeah.
But you didn't realize, it was so fast, you didn't realize that what it was actually doing
Right.
was
Brute force.
brute force.
Yeah.
A friend of mine said that people have made it fun of various things like Fortran, right? And one of the problems with, I think it was Steve Glanville that told me this, one of the problems with Fortran is kind of complicated and not well specified. And how do you know whether it's working right or not? And the answer is, you try it. And you try it against the test suite. And so I think it was Steve that told me, the way you write a Fortran compiler is you take a long string, binary string of zeros, and then you convert that to ASCII. This is a joke, but you convert that to ASCII text and try it out. If that doesn't work, you increment by 1, and then you try again. Well, obviously you wouldn't start with 0, 0, 0. You start with something that's printable, but you get the message, right? And it was really funny. So, a lot of times writing compilers there's a lot of iteration, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes things weren't well defined.
Yeah. So, Michael, would you like to sort of just talk a little bit about what each of these pieces of this prototype are?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So this, of course, is the computer itself, right? It always, ever since I had it, it always had this one interesting wooden leg, and none over here. So this is, as I had it. And then this is obviously a very, very early, it's a non-production one-button Lisa mouse. Keyboard using the standard, quarter-inch connector that they all had. And a obviously early, but still very much like the final, production card cage in the back with various, CPU card, I/O card, memory, stuff like that. And then some flavor of Twiggy drives here.
So I think what happened was they knew what the chassis was going to look like, and they were working on the plastic, but there wasn't any plastic yet. And so there were a bunch of machines that were just all sheet metal. Witness the wooden leg. And then eventually, the plastic showed up, and you start seeing them like we know them later, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And then
there was a whole series of these with the Corvus drive. Trying to do the development on the floppies was not real.
So the Corvus drive was a hard drive?
It was a hard drive.
Right.
5 megabyte?
probably, yeah.
I think.
And so that predated the profile?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what happens, we went out and bought a few Corvus drives, and people use those.
So that was just a third-party
Yeah.
drive? Okay,
But
so
they
it wasn't developed by Apple?
They were pretty big.
They were big,
like,
yeah.
oh, I don't know, 4 or 5 inches tall, about yay wide, about this long. I mean, they were pretty big, but they worked pretty well. And then that gave way to the profile. And you saw, you saw machines with the profile sitting on top.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then eventually, I guess, profile got stuck inside with profile up and the floppy on the bottom.
Right, in the Lisa 2.
Yeah.
Right, the follow-on. So this is the Corvus connector?
That's the Corvus interface.
Yeah.
So this is a board that you plug into the machine that allows it to interface with the Corvus hard drive?
Right.
And it could talk to the ST506 based profile as well.
okay.
So there's two different connectors, Corvus and the Pippin, which is
And I
the
think the Pippin
profile.
was the profile.
Oh, so the Pippin was the code name for the profile hard drive.
Yep.
Okay. So this is a board that could connect either of the hard drives.
Right.
Yep. And then this is
And then before that was this one.
right. So
Long before that.
this is an umbilical that lets you this part here goes into an Apple II. This goes into the expansion in the back there, and then there's cable connecting the two.
The cable plugs in to the.
Yep, and then that lets you use the Apple II as
A disk.
glorified storage.
Yep, as a disk drive.
Oh, it's just a disk drive?
It's just as to get to 2 floppies. Yeah.
Oh, okay, because this is before
Because
the internal floppies worked, so
Yeah.
you use the Apple II's floppy disk drives.
Just to have something. yeah.
Okay, interesting.
And it gave you a compatibility between the Apple II floppies and Lisa, because not knowing what to do for a file system, I just adopted UCSD file format.
Oh, UCSD Pascal
And-
file format.
And so whether you read and wrote your floppy on the Apple II with UCSD Pascal or you wrote it with a monitor, it was interchangeable, right?
Huh.
And yeah, so for I don't know how long, for 6 months or more, everybody was using the umbilical to the Apple II. And the floppies didn't, like I said, didn't matter whether the floppies were read and written by monitor or written by the UCSD Pascal. Same
Okay.
platform.
So by monitor, you mean the
Lisa monitor.
okay, which was the operating system?
Yeah. Essentially, all the Lisa development was done on, and all the Mac development was done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Because it was, I don't know, it was probably 85 or 86 before the more full-blown development system started getting created. So the initial one that me and Ken and Bruce and Chris did that lasted for like, I don't know, 5, 6 years or something.
Oh, okay. Wait, so then the Lisa workshop, which was the UCSD Pascal environment that ran on the Lisa, was that developed later?
I guess so. I don't remember that. So it must have been
Okay.
probably is in '86 or something. Yeah.
That's after the Lisa was discontinued though.
Or maybe they started it in '85. And maybe
Oh,
it was
okay.
Yeah, I just didn't notice.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was.
I was going to say there was a kind of like that. There was a precursor to this one, and so what had happened was Steve and Bill and Bruce and I had gone up to Xerox PARC, and we saw the stuff at Xerox, and I came back and Bill started tinkering with menus and drawing things on the screen and stuff, and I ended up flying down to Austin. I think it was like, November or something, and talked to the 68,000 team. And prior to the 68,000, so for most of '79, and kind of the reason I had gotten hired was the original lease was going to be a 2900 AMD 2900 bit slice, and John wanted me to do the firmware for that because I was doing a lot of the firmware back at HP, so I kind of got pulled in to go do the firmware, and then like I said, I got to late '79, October November time frame, and I visited Motorola, came back, and kind of suggested to everybody, why don't we trash the bit slice and let's just go use the 68K, and so that gained steam pretty quickly, and then late that year, early 1980, I started building a board with the 68K and a few other things on it, and we built a couple of those. Maybe I built one in December because I had to give something to Bill to play with, and then I want to say that Paul built the first one of these.
Paul Baker?
Paul Baker, sometime in 1980. But you should ask Paul when he built his first one. I don't remember, but I would say it's probably sometime in 1980.
Okay. So we think this machine is actually from '82. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's probably. We know the Twiggies were from '82, but what did I send in my email to you guys? I sent you an email. And I said,
Yeah, I think when we talked on the phone, you mentioned is
Was it
probably
82?
'82.
Okay. Because I think I expanded the date code on a few things, and I think it said '82. But I think maybe the precursors to this were probably sometime in '80. But I don't know for sure.
Okay. Is there anything special about the mouse, or this specific mouse, this prototype?
I mean, it's a different. This is a production mouse with a, different cabling, and it's not that different. But the connector itself is got a different way of staying attached.
And this one has a D9, or
Yeah, DB9,
yeah.
and they're the same.
So I think Apple learned maybe the hard way. Like you said, that one has a method for staying attached. Between the Apple II and Lisa and Macintosh, the early, and not only just early, but lasted a few years. They had the DIN connector cables, and they're plugging machines together for AppleTalk.
Right.
And the problem was that the cable that plugged into the Mac or the Lisa or the Apple II, there was no locking mechanism. You just push it in.
Push it in, yeah.
As long as somebody doesn't come along and
Bump it.
trip on it or whatever, you're okay. But the problem was each computer had 2 ports, and you plug one in as like the in, and the other one is the out, and and then you just daisy chain all the computers, and you know, and then the Apple Talk protocol uses the SCC to transmit stuff over the cable, and works fine, provided nobody pulls the plug anywhere. The problem is
breaks the.
if you got 5 of these, it's real easy to like double check all 5 are plugged in. You got 50 of them.
Yeah, it's
all
a
of
mess.
a sudden the network goes down. It's like, okay, somebody tripped on the cable somewhere, and you look around, and then you find one laying on the floor.
Right.
Yeah.
And speaking of networking, so when I purchased this stuff from Brian, he was in like this process of moving from Santa Cruz to Ohio, and he was he's like, I have more stuff. So how about we agree that I will include, it's all documented in email that I passed on, but like 9 additional things beyond the computer that we have here today. And then later he sent me a list of what some of these things were, and some of them were, I think, other types of drive adapters maybe. I'd already purchased a color card, but then a bunch of AppleNet stuff was part of what I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. So I wound up having a bunch of these boxes and then cables with these big, because like 10 base 2, right? It's BNC connectors, right? This is like a bigger version of that.
This is like 10 megabit Ethernet.
I don't know what AppleNet really was, but there were these boxes that had multiple connectors and some. So I don't know if you know much about what Apple. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. The Apple Talk really worked quite well, except for the hard lesson of that's why we have cable locks.
Right. So let's move on to this machine. So this is, you mentioned earlier, was called the Great Little Machine, or the GLM. And so do you want to say more? So this was the main board.
Yeah. So it's a collection of boards similar to the Lisa design. It literally is a Lisa card cage. Is that the right name?
Yeah.
For it? Yeah.
And the main reason for using that was, we already knew what the connector pin was. It already had power. It was a convenient way to,
just get it going.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Makes total
It was
sense.
just really convenient.
So this is the main CPU board with a bunch of memory, and it has a 10 megahertz 68K, so it's relatively quick. This is a video board that is black and white, got a significantly larger display than anything that had been there before.
Yeah, this is a lot bigger.
Yeah.
Well, but and many more pixels.
Right. What resolution was this?
I don't know.
I want to say it was like on the order of like 1152 by 768 or something.
Wow, that's really high for that time.
Yeah, no, it definitely was higher resolution.
So Bill and Mark and all of them, they were just first of this one and then later that one. They were in heaven.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah. And then there's an I/O board, and
I think the main reason for the I/O board was to get to the profile.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then there's a fairly kind of standardish board that has the 1/4-inch connector for the keyboard, and the mouse, DB9, and another like DB15. I don't know what that was for. And then there's that floppy drive that connected to, I don't know, the I/O board, I guess.
So this is like a standard Sony 3.5-inch.
Yep.
That was in the Macintosh.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that the Twiggy never really
didn't quite work.
It almost did.
And then this is the video output that has there's a board here on the end where these wires go in, and that plugged in on here, and you would in theory get a picture. So
given that some disk drive projects at Apple succeeded and some didn't, I would say that on average Apple was pretty successful, and
Well,
doing its own stuff.
depended on whether Woz was on the team,
Wow.
the team or not.
That's funny.
Yeah, there was the original one with the Seagate mechanism and Woz's electronics, and then the Twiggy didn't do as well, but then the profile turned out real well. So it's like, and the idea was, one of the most expensive components to any computer is the storage. And if you can, whether it's floppy, old days, or a little bit later, a hard disk drive, the disk drive is a big part of the cost of a computer. So the Apple logic was, let's build our own storage, because then we'll keep the markup on
Right.
it. And except for the Twiggy, I think it was actually a good concept, right?
Yeah.
So the
Makes-
profiles were pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty durable.
Yeah.
So this is an evolutionary branch. Like, how did this figure in, or what do you recall?
Oh. Well, like we said, that most of these were black and white, but I did a couple that were color, and the main reason for doing that was to have a precursor to color and work on color quick draw. Right, so I worked on color quick draw a little bit. Bill picked it up and finished it off, and then the 68020 came along, and basically the same machine there became the 68020. But since all the machines going out the door were black and white, all the 020 machines were black and white, big screen black and white.
And what did this leading to that then lead to?
Well, one could argue it led to eventually the Mac 2, but the Mac 2 was slower than that one, and you might also argue that it led to Next.
Because you went and started Next.
Long story short, what happened was, I don't know if I'll say this anyway. Most people understand that most computers and most technology products go through what people call an S-curve. And what happens is, when the product's brand new and there's excitement, and people just have to have one, right? People buy it. It doesn't matter whether it's what it is. It's any computer or other technology. But at some point, the people who had to have it initially, those buyers evaporate, right?
The early
Everybody who really
adopters,
wants one
yeah.
has one. And then the other people end up buying it only when there's more you can do with it. And having only like 2 apps or 3 apps is typically not enough, right? And so what happens is, generally sales on the product will fade, and then at some point third-party apps will show up, and there are more and more reasons to buy the product, and then the product comes back up on the other side of the S-curve. I guess Steve didn't believe in the S-curve, or didn't think it would apply to him. Steve liked to break the laws of business and physics, right? And I think he thought, the Mac is just going to go, up. The sales are just going to go up. And part of the reason that sales did so well was Apple spent a lot of money on every Macintosh during 1984, right? And I think Apple was spending like $800-900 per unit, and they built it for about $1,800. And that's $2,700, and they sold it for $2,495. So there was like a $200 bill stapled onto every Macintosh, so to speak, for a while. But then all that sales and marketing kind of faded at some point, because Apple, didn't want to spend that money anymore, and so that helped. Unfortunately, that helped slow the Mac sales down. So we get to early '85, and Mac sales are kind of starting to roll over, and Steve's saying, "Oh no, they're going up." So the gap got bigger. And then I wasn't involved, but there was a fight between Scully and Jobs over that gap, and that's when Steve lost his job.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes off, so around March or April, he goes off to Italy for a few months. And late the previous year and early that year, I was building the O20 machines. And what I wanted to do is basically turn that one into a Big Mac product. But Steve got pushed out, and Jean-Louis Gasset became the Mac division manager. And I understand what happened. I wasn't happy with it, but I understand what happened. He basically canceled anything that had Steve's name on it, because he wanted to like restart everything and put his name on everything. And the problem was, even though Steve wasn't really involved with that one, it had my name on it, which implied that it had Steve's name on it. And so Jean-Louis Gasset said no. I went to Scully, and Scully said, well, whatever Gasset wants to do, that's what we're doing. He's running the division. And I'm like, oh, okay. And that was, I guess, July. And Steve comes back, and then over the summer, the five of us, Daniel, Bud, Susan, George, and myself, we meet with Steve a couple of times over the summer. And then Friday the 13th, September, the five of us resigned, and then by Monday we had next, and we had a lawsuit. So one funny thing there was we get into the whole deposition phase, and I don't know exactly what happened back at Apple, but I think what happened was they took my name, Page, and they put it into Lexis with other computer terms and stuff, and ended up with a stack of paper that was very, very thick. And then they took the stack of paper and divided it up like in 10 pieces. And they took an engineer and a lawyer for each of the pieces. And they spent months going through it, trying to figure out what I had done and what I hadn't done. And you know, and that was funny. So about 2/3 of the way through this whole thing, Steve and I would meet with Al Eisenstadt, about once every 6 weeks or so. And I remember we were like 4 months into this.
He was Apple's legal counsel?
Yeah, Al was the general counsel for Apple. And we met with Al, and Al's complaining to Steve and I, and he says, this is getting really expensive. And I remember Steve said something like, you could stop. Which sounds easy, but it wasn't that easy, because Brown and Bain was the lawyers, and Jack Brown had taken the case himself. And Jack Brown's attitude was, I don't lose and I don't give up. Which means he continues to the very end, right? And as far as he's concerned, he always won. And he was very good at what he did. And Brown and Bain was out of Phoenix, and so anyway, eventually Apple managed to talk him into stopping, and then we had a press release that we made. It didn't say anything, but other than two parties agreed to go their separate ways. One last funny thing, and I don't know how often this has happened in history, but when I was getting deposed, Ottenweiler kept asking questions, and Gary Moore kept saying, you can't ask that question. And then they'd go and get on the phone with the judge, and then the judge would make a ruling, and they'd come back, and then we skip that question, and then Ottenweiler would ask another question, and Gary said, no, you can't ask that, that's confidential. And they'd go back and talk to the judge again. And this went around in circles for, I don't know, like 2 hours on the first day. And then late morning, the judge volunteers, I guess he was like semi-retired, the judge volunteers to come down and sit over the deposition. And and Gary told me, he says, I've never seen this before. Judges do not sit over depositions. And I think the reason he wanted to do it was because Apple was involved, right? So he did, and it went on for a couple of days. And then the punchline to that whole thing was, we're like on the third day, and it's afternoon, and we're near the end. And we've been talking about a lot of technical stuff. And then the judge says, time out, let's go off the record. And he turns to me and he says, now Unix, is that hardware or software? And I'm like, oh my God. This is the level of understanding we're doing it. Yeah. It was really funny. Yeah. So, but it would be interesting to find out how many depositions I've had judges sitting over there, because what Gary told me was, I mean, he'd been doing this for decades at that point, and Gary told me, I've never seen this before. I think he was just attracted to it because of Apple's involvement.
Right. So I'm really curious, is like, this is both a successor to the Lisa and the Macintosh? Like, what parts of this are Lisa and what parts of this are
It's more generic 68K. You can run you could just run anything on it. It didn't really matter.
Oh, so the hardware was, okay, so it was just yeah. But then what software did it run on?
Well, I brought up the monitor.
Oh, the Lisa
most
monitor.
people that were doing development, whether it's Bill or Mark or David or others, they were all just running the monitor
Oh, okay.
and then downloading their code to the Mac, right?
To another Mac.
Right, to a real Mac.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So this never actually ran the original Macintosh
No.
system?
No.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay.
The primary purpose was to run the monitor fast,
Oh, okay.
so you could run the compiler.
Oh, okay. So did you develop?
And the big screen gave you,
More real estate. And
more real
Yeah.
estate, so you could, when you're in the editor,
Right.
you want as much screen as you can get, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's a really big software development
Yeah.
machine. Okay.
And then the 68020 one was the same thing,
Yeah.
but just faster.
Right.
Why don't we get that over here and then we'll talk about that. Tell us about this machine and sorts of relationship to this one.
This one I don't know very much about, other than that it is, it is an evolution. You can tell it's, got some more sophistication.
What's it called?
It's called a Big Mac prototype.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's something that you worked on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the one that was the last thing I did at Apple. And the problem was, I wanted to take this and turn it into a product and push it out the door, and I guess I didn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So, what was unfortunate was the Mac 2 went out the door, and it was slower than this one. And so people like Bill and David and Mark and others, they didn't want to let go of theirs because, it was
Fast.
faster.
Yeah.
Well, so what was in this? What?
Oh, it's a 16 megahertz. This one's a 16 megahertz, 68020.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think we had a few that before I left that were 20 megahertz.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the Mac 2 was?
Mac 2, I think, was like 10 or 12 or something. Yeah.
Okay.
Don't remember.
So the Big Mac, so this is an evolution over this
No,
machine.
Yeah, but basically rip out the 68,000 and plug in the 20 and make a few other changes.
Yeah, okay.
And somehow I discovered Sims instead of
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
sockets.
Yep.
Right, because the RAM there is on Sims and it's
Yeah,
not
and this
soldered
one's
onto
just
the.
socketed.
Yeah.
Mm. That's interesting.
Interesting.
And this also has like a hardwired MMU, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah. Literally, right there.
So is the provenance of this machine the same as these, or did you get this from a different?
No, this is not one that I had.
Oh, okay. So
No,
this is
that's
from
why I
our-
don't really
this
know
is a
that much
different,
about it.
This is from our collection, but
Correct.
it's yeah. Okay, well, it's cool that we have this. I didn't know previously we had this.
But I think if you were to search out the wires on the power plug there,
Mm-hmm. Oh,
you'd find it's
It's the
things
same.
that you did for this one.
that would make sense.
Because you know,
Yeah, it's the
not-
same
not
kind of
just
connector
reuse
for
the same
sure.
power pin connector over and over and over.
Yeah.
And I don't know, we kept using this, I don't know where we discovered these power supplies, but we found these and we decided we like those. And
Yeah, I mean, it's
Yeah.
similar to an Apple II power supply, but
yeah. But they were inexpensive and they worked really well. Yeah.
Huh.
A little big, but not too bad.
Is there anything else about the Big Back that either of you can tell us about?
Not too much. A funny thing did happen though. Doesn't really have much to do with this, but I'll tell you anyway.
Okay.
Apple was buying lots of 68,000s, and I got a few samples of the 68020 from Tom Gunner's team, and then at some point, after he gave us a few,
He was at Motorola.
yeah, we had to buy some,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't remember how many we bought. We bought like 20 of them or 30 of them or something, some modest number. And if you'd just gone in off the street and wanted to buy a 68020, Motorola probably would charge you a couple $100.
mm-hmm.
And I think we paid like $25 or $20 or something because we're buying all these 68,000s. Tom couldn't charge us too much.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this little company up in the Northeast, and it's called Apollo Computer.
Mm.
And I don't know exactly how. Motorola had an IBM 370 or something, and they had their sales system on there. And I don't know how they did it, but they had an unlimited number of characters for the customer name. And so what they did, when they put a customer name into the computer, they truncated them, they abbreviated them, they took out some letters and stuff. If you start taking characters out of Apollo Computer and an Apple computer, if you're not careful, there's great similarity.
Uh-huh.
And so I guess these two names were sitting on the system, and there were only one character difference, with a few vowels taken out. Right? They obviously kept the O and the E. Somebody mistyped the name on the invoice, and my invoice for the 20 or 30 16020s ended up in Massachusetts.
Oh no.
And I think that Apollo was buying a small quantity, a few per month, and I think they were paying like $200 each, and I was buying them like at $20 a piece. Well, this invoice shows up, in Massachusetts, and I think the phone lines to the 512 area code were on fire that day. And yeah, that was funny. And so yeah, they were a bit unhappy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why is Apple out in Cupertino getting these for $20 and we're paying $200?
Yeah,
So
that's pretty
another
good.
funny thing, doesn't have much to do with it, but another funny thing about Tom, I guess Tom worked a lot of hours, and so did I for that matter. But I knew that when I wanted to talk to Tom, the thing to do was call him up early in the morning, first thing. Because I knew when he got to work, and he was like in his office, it was kind of quiet, like at 6:30 in the morning, in Texas. And so I knew if I really, really had to talk to him, what I would do is I'd get up early in California, and I would grab him just as he came into the office. And I thought that was kind of obvious. But I was one of his more important customers. But the really funny part was Jack and Doug and the others all reported to Tom. But they had even though they were in the same building as him, they had a hard time hooking up with him and getting his attention. And every once in a while, Jack or Doug would call me up and say, "You're probably going to talk to Tom before I do. Could you give him this message?" It was really funny. Yeah.
That's pretty good.
But I understood the problem. The problem was, Tom was just super, super busy running from, me and traveling and all this stuff, and Jack and Doug just had a hell of a time trying to, get a few minutes of his time. We probably have all been in that situation at least once.
Yeah.
It was funny. So I talked with Tom. I talked with him maybe 10, 12 years ago, but he wasn't doing very well. So I'm guessing he's probably not around anymore. But for sure.
So let's see. So originally we labeled this a Lisa mouse because it looks pretty similar to this Lisa mouse. But you said that this actually came with this machine, the Great Little Machine.
Yep.
Okay. So even though it is actually like a production Lisa mouse, but it was part of this machine. Interesting.
Yes.
I don't know if there was really much difference between the electronics of the be interesting to prove. I don't know if there was much difference between the Lisa mouse and the Mac mouse.
Yeah, I don't know.
I could someday try to prove that.
Let's see. And this power supply, you said that you built this.
I didn't build it. It's a PC power supply, and
you adapted it.
Yeah, because this was a known thing. I have a set of schematics at home for Lisa. And anyways, you could go and see what voltages were needed, and I did some amount of fiddling around with the wires to get the right signals on the right pins, and then the thing would kind of power up.
Oh, okay. All right. So then of course here we have the floppy disk drive, and then this is looks like a standard Apple 80B mouse.
Yeah, that I think Brian just here it goes with it, and doesn't actually have a way to plug in. So
okay. So okay, that's kind of.
He moved to Ohio. Huh?
Yeah, he wanted. After I purchased these things from him, and then the AppleNet stuff showed up and whatever else, I wasn't really in contact with him, so I have no idea what happened after that.
Okay. Well, are there any other stories about these machines or the development of these machines, or do you have any other stories about the provenance of these, and where they came from?
No, I think the Ken Friedenbach, connection, and that these may have well been his. I think there's probably a lot to that. I think I've heard mumblings about that from others as well.
It makes sense to me. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Well, are we done? Is that it?
I guess so.
I think we're good.
I think we're good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
Okay.
Yeah,
this is
thanks
really
for
fun.
finally doing this. Like I said,
Yeah.
it's been 20-something years in the making. So yeah, glad we did it. Thank you.
Awesome.